You've just entered the Disaster Tough podcast, the place for emergency managers, first responders, and humanitarians who want to get the job done. Stories, lessons, and tips are provided by field experts. I'm your host, John Scardina, owner of Doberman Emergency Management and former federal emergency response official who's responded to some of the most extreme disasters. Disaster Tough is our mantra. It combines experience, training, and analytics in order to be successful at any stage within the disaster lifecycle. It means being a professional in emergency and disaster services. Doberman Emergency Management lives by this. If your organization needs to fill a gap, please contact us. We can help. Contact info is in the show notes. We also support other products and organizations that will increase your ability. For example, if you fight wildfires, hurricanes, a pandemic, any disaster in the field, at a hospital or command center, listen up. You're missing out if you do not use L3 Harris for your radio comms. They are secure, portable, mobile, and scalable, which is great news for us in the field. A truly disaster-tough radio system. Check out the XL family of radios by clicking on the show notes or simply go to l3harris.com.
The battle to monitor and contain COVID-19 just got exponentially better for us. We are officially introducing an electronic, reusable COVID-19 test through our sponsors. It's called COVID Plus Test, created by Tiger Tech, distributed by FS Global. This is the first FDA-authorized, rapid, non-invasive pre-screener. It's incredibly easy to use. Forget those one-time use swabs. This is a disaster-tough technology. For more information on COVID Plus Test, check out our show notes. Welcome back to the show, everybody. It's your host, John Scardina. Man, I am weirdly excited about this episode because it's a super horrific topic, but a very important topic to cover, especially on Father's Day weekend. And we're going to be covering into some of that mental health side in a second. But before I introduce my guest here, I just want to preface this episode that on our show we cover actual events, as I've talked before with other guests, and some of those events, of course, are man-made, and we don't want to turn it into an entertaining thing. We don't want to turn it into something light, but what we do want to do is say, hey, this is an actual event with real people, and let's figure out the after actions of what we can do to make it better. And so even though we're talking about on the show, I hope you can understand the seriousness of the topic, you can understand the weight of it, and most importantly, prevent it. And so if you can prevent it and prevent the impacts of it, which we're going to be covering a little bit, you know, we can do better in this field. And so we're going to be talking about the Pulse Nightclub shooting that happened about 5 years ago. In fact, almost to the date of this episode. We're going to be talking to the incident commander, Chief Bryan Davis, who actually responded to the event and is going to be talking to us about that. And then finally, we're going to be talking about if you've been involved in this event, which some of us unfortunately have, or if it's going to happen in the future, which we feel like at this point is kind of inevitable, how can you help yourself and your family move on from a horrific scene? And Bryan's a really great example of doing that. He's going to be talking about those experiences today. Chief, welcome to the show.
John, thank you so much, man. I'm happy to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, it's kind of it's just kind of like the weird thing about our field, right? Because we all have had response experiences. A lot of us have response experiences, especially the guests and myself. And so you have this weight or this responsibility, this badge even of I've had these crazy response experiences. And it allows us to go into these topics, but at the same time, it's like, man, I wish I didn't have to have that badge. I wish I didn't have to have that associated. So understanding that you carry that weight, again, I think it's a great honor for us to have you on the show. Again, just before we even get started, and just thank you for responding. I've heard amazing things about the things you did in that response, and want to break that up. But even post-event, you've done a lot to be able to help out the responders and their families, to be their advocate, to be able to move on. And so that's a huge pitch for our show. It's like mental health and emotional health. So again, thanks for taking the time for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely, John. And it's one of those things. It's not something you want to be on the top of your resume. I mean, it is something you want to be proud of, but I've coined it as that worst best day ever type thing. It's the worst scenario. Your heart pours out for the victims, and both the victims from the shooter and the individuals that have suffered trauma as a result of the incident. But it was my best day in that I couldn't be more proud of the men and the women that actually rallied to the cause that evening. And we were able to affect a lot of rescues and save a lot of lives in the process. I mean, we weren't able to save the 49 that died as a result of these horrendous acts, but and that part of it makes us really sad. But we were able to actually save over 30 that were critically injured and wounded, and they made it to the trauma center and they survived the surgeries and everything else. So, we talk about my involvement in that, and I would like to allude, and everybody understands this, I'm sure, in the EM world and also in emergency response. It's a team effort, and I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the men and the women that were there on that event. It was some of the most professional actions I've ever witnessed. And it's not something that we were ready for, quite honestly. We talked about it. I think agencies across the country were talking about it, but it wasn't really on the forefront of what fire departments and EMS providers were prepared for. And it was large scale, huge magnitude when it hit.
Well, when it hit, it was the worst. Unfortunately, to date, it's not. But at the time, it was the worst active shooter event in U.S. history, and it was unique for so many different reasons. So for the listeners who somehow were hiding under a rock for the last 5 years and didn't know about this, so let me, if I may, sir, I'm gonna probably set up the context here a little bit, and then you can I'll set up like the pre-end, and you can talk about like the response.
Absolutely.
We don't ever share, for our listeners, we would encourage anybody in the field who is listening to this, please adopt this methodology. Never share the shooters or the terrorist names. We don't feel like they're worth sharing. And we want to change that mentality. So,
there, John.
Yeah, you can call them evil, you can call them broken, you can call them whatever you want. Just don't call them by their name. It's not worth remembering. But so the shooter goes into Pulse Nightclub. It is a gay nightclub in Orlando, goes in there, checks out the scene. There is an off-duty officer there, and security. He actually leaves and comes back. And as far as I know, there's a if I recall, there's an upper stage, a lower stage, a patio area. On the upper stage, the DJ. I'm talking like I've been there. I haven't been there, but I've done lots of active actions on it. Yeah, I love going there. The DJ has the booth was on the upper end with bathrooms on the back end where the upper end was, and so you have 320 people packed inside this club with some people on the patio when the shooting started around 2:02 in the morning. And you have people on the patio, a lot of confusion, obviously, because you already have sounds in a nightclub, but then you have to deal with shooting. Before we get into like really anything, what I find is most fascinating, what I always bring this up in our active shooter classes, telling people to know your exit. And the DJ had enough situational awareness, and in fact, some of the members did too, to understand that there was an exit behind the DJ. And so you had a flood of people going out, but I mean, essentially they were locked in there with this shooter. And so the fact that out of 320 people, it is horrible that 49 people lost their lives. However, it could have been much higher even. And so, that's the stage. And so you get this call around 2:00 in the morning. Can you kind of walk us through that process of like the next actions you took?
Yeah, it was, it's one of those things that's a bit surreal. Been in the fire service and a first responder, worked as a flight paramedic for a local program and a trauma flight program for many years, so you get accustomed to what the units are and what they're responding to and everything else. And when that call was dispatched, the units that were assigned to the call seemed a bit out of the norm for me. Like I'm like, wait a minute, what are we going to? Because it was just a myriad of units. Most departments have an SOP, where they have a mass casualty assignment that consists of so many units and so on and so forth. And this one didn't really meet that. Like I wasn't really sure at first. And it was a lot of units. So I'm thinking, okay, what's really going on? 2:00 in the morning, downtown Orlando, one of the busiest nights of the week in the city. They've got events all up and down Orange Avenue. They've got concerts going on that have streets closed. I mean, it's just one of the busiest nights for us. And we automatically move over to an operational TAC, and everybody gives responding. And before that, probably one of the most revered and admired lieutenants in our organization, now retired, he was the company officer that was at the station that was right next to the Pulse Nightclub. And rarely, if ever, did you hear any fluctuations in his voice on the radio. He was usually pretty calm, cool, collective. And he came across the radio in this very, I don't want to call it high-pitched, but several tones higher than normal, very rapid. And I'm like, all right, something's not right, because I've never seen that in this lieutenant. This is a guy that you can count on to be really cool, calm, and collective in moments like that. And in those moments, and I'm sure in the years after, when people had an opportunity to review the audio, you can actually hear gunfire occurring in the background. So, my immediate response is, holy crap, my guys are in the middle of this and I'm a mile away, but yet there's not a thing I can do. Even when I get there, it's like, all right, we just got to figure out what we got and what we have going on. So immediately just went into, they're telling us multiple calls, multiple victims. Our communications division was overwhelmed with phone calls. I mean, 500, 600 calls within no time at all, because it was members, or it was people that were there and their families and everybody else. Because this is breaking. This is hitting the news everywhere immediately. So resources was big, obviously, in an emergency management and disaster preparedness and stuff. That's something we talk about a lot. So I asked for the world. I said, you know what, I'm being told I've got 20 to 30 victims. I mean, we're a department that consists of 17 stations. We provide our own transport in addition with private ambulance service, and then mutual aid agreements with other departments and stuff. And I'm like, man, if I've got 30 victims, my transport situation is already completely overwhelmed. Our hospitals, which fortunately for us, and this isn't always the case, but fortunately for us, our level 1 trauma center was literally 6-7 blocks away.
Oh my gosh.
Our other trauma center, that it's not a dedicated trauma center, but one that can receive overflow, was 6 or 7 miles away. So we have hospitals, but I've traveled to parts of the U.S. to talk about active shooter, and their closest trauma facility is an hour away. And that's by flight. So we were very fortunate, unfortunate, good. Like I said, best day, worst day ever. In best case scenario, we were where we were when it happened, and law enforcement was really active initially in getting some of those people out of there. And actually they saw how overwhelmed this was going to be. But the biggest thing for me was in this realm of chaos that we were diving into, somebody had to be that voice that just brings it all down. And I seem to be that shit magnet, the black cloud. I'm sure others that know me will tell you that, but it used to be whatever can happen will happen whenever I'm working. So it's something I've really tried to focus on as a chief officer, but it just, we had to bring it down a level. And the biggest piece of that, and I'm sure in your world of emergency management and disaster preparedness and stuff like that, one of the biggest thing is getting everything set up and having the resources and being organized.
The MOU.
My number one priority was the safety of the men and women that were responding, and the safety of my crews that were already literally 100 feet from this nightclub where this is taking place. And then basically I just kind of pulled the reins back on everybody. I said, listen, we just can't go running in there. We can't just all come pulling into this dead end and have no way out. We have to set this up for success. We have to set up the divisions, the groups, everything that you need with that. And, a lot of departments, myself included, we spent a lot of time with tabletop exercises. and even in mass casualty or disaster preparedness for hurricanes or tornadoes or earthquakes or whatever it may be. And we talk about all that stuff, but it's amazing how different it is when it actually happens, because the reality of it sets in and you're like, oh, this is insane. But held everybody back. I actually moved myself into a forward position in the scene very, very early on. Again, it's not anything I want anybody to relive emotionally, because some people will look at that and they'll remember it. I mean, still have the visual of driving down Orange Avenue and individuals running the other direction against me, carrying shooting victims and just trying to get them somewhere other than the immediacy of the nightclub itself. But you got set up, got positioned, made immediate contact with the station. I actually chose to set up the command post and stuff a little bit away from the station, but yet I still had a visual on everything that was going on. Probably initially, maybe a little too close for us, but I really needed to get a grasp. And the one thing too, law enforcement was there in numbers. We had agencies from all over Central Florida, FHP, Orange County, UCF police, Winter Park police. There were more cop cars and blue lights there than I think you could count in a year on any other given situation.
That's kind of what you want in that situation, though, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're there to help each other, right? We're there for their goal. We understand active shooter. You've done a lot with it. They really have three objectives. They're either going to confine, kill, or capture the shooter, and they want to stop the event. And we know most active shooter events, by definition, depending on whose definition you read, they're over within 10 minutes. Yes. This wasn't the case. This individual was actually shooting for more than 10 minutes. And it wasn't until he was barricaded into an area, the nightclub, that was pretty inaccessible to law enforcement, that now this evolved into a hostage situation. So really this thing came in waves for us. We set up an MCI. We operated under that premise. We had all our groups and divisions working. And again, the discipline of the members that were responding really are what made this, to the degree it was, successful, because they were disciplined. They used a little bit of reserve, and they knew that it was absolutely critical that we really built on the foundation for this and made sure that we all just didn't come running in and then we couldn't get out, meaning we can't get our transport group set up. We don't have any communications with the hospital. We don't have any communications with law enforcement, which was in partial the case. And we've learned a lot from that, I hope, as an industry, the importance of that unified command and having those communications and having a liaison and everything else. But yeah, it was just really surreal. And I mean, I've had some pretty enormous events in my career. And this one definitely just immediately stood out. And really what stood it out in the beginning was the lieutenant and just his voice, just the change. He never wavers in that at all. And just to hear it in his voice, I knew then, I said, this is not just a shooting where we've got one or two or three victims. This is a big deal. And especially when he keys up and you can hear the shooting in the background. I'm like, holy cow, what do we got?
Yeah, you're right there. So yeah. You bring up a lot of points to show why it was so unique. So yeah, you're right. Most, like 90% of active shooters are under 10 minutes. Yeah. You got 10 minutes to save people's lives. And run, hide, fight doesn't just mean run, hide, fight. It means a lot more than that. The other thing that you brought up is there's a discussion. I really push back on the discussion. I think it's semantics and I think it's stupid most of the time. But there's no question with this active shooter. People say active shooters are not terrorists. Well, they are terrorists. But this guy especially was. I mean, he claimed affiliation and allegiance to ISIS. He, talked about strapping people. He had hostages. It was very different than, I hate to say normal, but the most common active shooter, which is psychologically broken, just goes in there for a head count, bang, 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 and then kill myself, done. Right? That's kind of their typical MO. So 3 hours versus 10 minutes, claiming allegiance to ISIS, calling 911 multiple times, calling a news station, posting on Facebook. There's so many differences of why this was even outside of what we would have been training for. You look at So like you brought up the uniqueness of this, and we're talking about it, right? So the other two that are unique in my mind are the Aurora shooting with the theater,
The movie theater. Yep,
which,
absolutely.
you know, you talk about being 6 blocks away, and in this world, people have they can make their own choices, and they should. And most of the time, it's good choices, but sometimes it's absolutely horrific. But you know, there's still sometimes the hand of God that just gets placed in like, okay, this horrific things happen, but the trauma center is 6 blocks away,
Yeah.
or the fact in the Aurora shooting, like I just brought up, the time the active shooter started was the transfer time for all law enforcement. So all the guys getting off and all the guys getting on, everybody was able to respond, and they were able to save a lot of people. And
Yeah, and I actually I've written a couple papers just for some college classes, and I've focused on it. And Aurora was one that I looked at. I looked at the after action reviews, and it was fortunate they had just completed. And actually, there was a SWAT training that was taking place just miles from there that had just completed. So they had those resources there really quite fast, as did we. I mean, I had OPD officers and other law enforcement members coming by me like I was standing still. And I don't exactly stand still when I'm responding to an emergency. So to have somebody come by me, I'm like, holy cow, you really start to grasp what's going on here more by what's happening in your surroundings than you are actually what you're visually seeing in the scene. And that a lot of times for me is kind of how I gauge the severity or the enormity of the event is what's happening in the periphery, if you will, with law enforcement and everything else, you know. So,
well, that's an excellent point, because I went from Hurricane Harvey directly to the Northern California wildfires. Hurricane Harvey, it was like the same thing. Like, you couldn't, if you stopped to look around you of all the different parts that were moving and how fast people were going, you would have gotten behind the curve, because you would have just been blown away by all the immediate parts for life saving. But in the wildfires, at least for the role that I got out there, they were also calling it a type 1, most catastrophic. And it was catastrophic for sure for the people. But in terms of like complexity, like people were working 12-hour shifts and going home, you know, like that's not type 1. And I'm probably going to get a lot of pushback from the people, because obviously lives were impacted. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about the complexity. Pulse Nightclub is a type 1 event because, again, not 10 minutes, 3 hours, claiming affiliation with, ISIS. And as you noted, a million things happening at the same time. And so what I like to tell people is, like, sometimes it's hard to figure out when you're in to classify type 1, type 2, type 3. I don't know really what a type 2 is, but I always know what a type 3 is.
Yeah.
You know, a county flood.
Not a type 1.
So, exactly. Yeah. And I know what a type 1 is, right? So, so that's interesting that you researched Aurora too, though. That's
and I've done others. I mean, obviously, I had an opportunity at the request of did some things for Department of Homeland Security, and just had an opportunity to do some stuff up in Indiana and Indianapolis and some other departments. And it was in the moment, it was definitely get that message out there. Listen, you can never be too prepared, but it's like I mentioned early on, we do spend a lot of time. A lot of departments spend an inordinate amount of time in preparing for mass casualty. And what we've always known mass casualty to be is, and I'm sure if you've tabletopped one, it's that hurricane, it's a tornado, it's an overturned school bus, it's a tanker truck that dumped all its acid all over the road, and we got a chemical cloud. But we've never really, until the last 5 years, as an industry, we've never really sat down and said, okay, this is what just happened, and what measures were in place. What did the after action review, which in my opinion, fairly accurate, but not really in the eyes of the individuals that lived that event. And I can say that I looked at the Las Vegas event a year later. I actually had an opportunity to meet some of the individuals that were working that event a year later, because we did have members that traveled from Orlando to Las Vegas, part of our peer support program and stuff that they were trying to launch at the time, go out there. You know, when we had Pulse happen, and I'm segueing a sidebar a little bit, but this is going to get into your peer support and your mental wellness and stuff like that. But we had a tremendous amount of outpouring from other departments, FDNY, Boston FD, individuals that have been through very similar tragedies, and they traveled down here with the International Association of Firefighters and on their own accord, because they had just been through a tragedy themselves, whether it be the Boston Marathon bombing or 9/11, whatever. It's going to impact people. But with this event, it evolved over 3 hours. We've hit on that a couple different times. It went from an active shooter with a high level MCI acuity to an EOD. For us, if everybody's using the same terminology, it's an explosive ordnance device. They had several bomb sniffing dogs there that actually had positive hits on the same vehicle, and in a hostage situation. And, then so it evolved. It really had several moving parts, several components that were occurring. And during this 3 hours, it actually went in waves, because there were opportunities where law enforcement were able to get into the nightclub while they had this guy barricaded in the back and continue to remove victims and get them out to us. For us, the idea of ballistics and all that wasn't something that was fully introduced to the department yet. It wasn't readily accessible for us, and we weren't really prepared to operate in that hot zone, if you will. I know 5 years have passed, and there's been a lot of discussions of where EMS providers will and will not operate. And even to this day, speaking with some of the high in command law enforcement officers there, they're like, they've said, we didn't expect you to go into the nightclub. And sometimes there's an expectation, and that's the big thing, John. As the incident commander and as the guy calling the shots, at one point, I basically had to say, no, we're not doing that. I'm not putting my individuals in that position. We've not been trained for it. I understand it. We're first responders, right? What we do has evolved. It's no longer, we don't just get 911 calls for cats in the tree and houses that are on fire. We get called for anything that somebody deems an emergency in their eyes. And that's what we've evolved to. So we've added all these components. We've added hazmat, we've added aviation rescue, whatever, disaster preparedness, tornadoes, hurricanes, wildfires, you name it. And this industry has evolved, and it's a lot of data and a lot of information for us to keep up with. I feel like a lot of things went really, really well for us. Whether there's some opportunities for improvement in what we do, that's going to be the case with anything. And unfortunately, it takes that event to actually occur before you know what your weaknesses are. You're not able to exploit those weaknesses sitting on a tabletop exercise. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah, your process, it can be flawless, and yet you can still have casualty.
Absolutely.
Right. And that's just like the reality of the field. I like that phrase. What is that other phrase? You can do everything right and still lose.
Yeah.
And so like that's like a really big thing. And so I guess for our field, like I said, we have emergency managers, first responders on here, military personnel, whatever. You talk about after action reviews. What are some of the high level things that any department could? In fact, I want to bring up the other thing too in a second about how it's expanding into other areas. We'll talk about that. But what are your specific after actions? What you did really well, and what you think others people should to at least ingest or digest for their departments.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of activity in the last couple of years that is disheartening. Obviously, right? We just had one at a railroad or a facility. We've had one at a distribution center with 5, 7, 10 casualties, and it's certainly, you don't like to sit and listen to that. But those were confined in terms of the geographic specificity of that. They happened in a very small, localized area of a warehouse or in a yard or something of that nature. And the things that worked really well in this scenario, and I can't overemphasize this enough, the use of ICS and the incident command structure and understanding NIMS, even though it was derived from wildland firefighting and adapted into the world of first responders and stuff, that absolutely proves beneficial. And you've got to get those things moving early, even if you anticipate that this thing is going to expand or going to grow. It's easier to get those resources moving early And, I've heard some people, not specifically this event, but I've heard others, they overreacted. They did this, not specifically the Pulse or me, but just in general conversation. Sometimes when we talk about disaster and stuff, way too many resources, what a waste, or this, that. No, I don't believe you can have too many resources when it is scaling and it's growing exponentially. So getting these groups and divisions and understanding ICS, I mean, there was an opportunity for improvement, obviously, in our unified command. And obviously that's identified in the after action review. And I own part of that as the incident commander, even though I wasn't the highest ranking official on the scene. And it really was probably outside of my scope of what I should be doing. It was identified. And at the end of the day, I represented the members in the organization that was present on that scene. And I saw an opportunity for where we could have done better with that. But so did the other agency that we were supposed to be working together with in that unified command. So, things that went well, right? The guys just operating with some control and maturity and just taking it step by step. They knew they had a task in front of them, unlike any other they've had in their career. And most of these individuals I've worked with for my entire career at the fire department. And I knew what to expect, right? You know your strengths and weaknesses, you know what you can expect, but these men and women were flawless in their execution of doing what we had to do. But getting that early, getting it set up, really understanding really what you have and how, and the enormity of it, whether it's 5 patients, 10 patients, 50 patients. Fortunately, like you said, I mean, there were well over 300 people in that nightclub. I mean, the reports say this because this is what they're supposed to have, but let's push that number, closer to, 400 or 500 people in that nightclub. But regardless, it could have been a lot worse.
Yeah.
I think the biggest challenge is when I look at an event like that, and also when I reviewed Las Vegas's response a year later, geographically, the size of the event was spread out over several blocks. I mean, Las Vegas, people were running into the hotels and seeking shelter in some of the resorts and stuff were there. And a lot of that happened with us too. And, one of my lessons learned personally, and one of the things I would do differently is I would look at that geographic difference and separate it into maybe a northern division and a southern division or north or south or whatever, because we did have individuals that actually fled to the south of that nightclub, and our entire operation, including the trauma center, was on the north side. And we were cut off from getting down that main artery, Orange Avenue, which basically runs that north to south venue. We were cut off because that was the hot zone with that. Later in the as it evolved, yes, we did. I did decide to move some units down to that south side and start looking at, do we have anybody down there that we need to be accountable for? Going back to what really worked well, we had a lot of resources from our department. We had a lot of resources from our adjoining departments through our mutual aid agreements. And I utilized those resources. I had liaisons go to the trauma center because that way I have eyes and ears on what's going on there. I mean, ORMC, Orlando Health, our level 1 trauma center, they said, bring them all. And I'm thinking, all right, I've been in this system a long time. I used to fly on that helicopter that goes into that system. How are they going to handle them all? And somehow miraculously, anything that was a trauma alert or a red by our MCI category, they wanted it all. And man, they handled it, and they didn't lose a single one of them that were transported to that facility.
That's incredible.
But we created this flow, and that was the thing. Early on, you got to pull the reins back on all those transport units, and you got to get them to staging and then start bringing them in as you need them and coordinating all those efforts. So the discipline, the amount of discipline that was presented by all the officers that were put into those positions is what allowed this thing to really just move. And it was very fluid, if you will, in that when there was a demand, and it peaked on us a couple times. OPD would bring out another dozen victims, and then we were ready to receive them at the edge of that hot zone, if you will. And we moved them into, whether we could just move them into triage or get them right into transport and get them going to the trauma center. So, a lot of things went well, John. End of the day, you're always a professional. You're going to go back and look at it and say, okay, were there some opportunities for us to do things a little bit differently? at the end of the day, I still stand firmly that the opportunities I speak of would not have changed the outcome of the event. We would have still had 49 victims. We would have still had close to 40 that we rescued, because those operational changes, the presence in that unified command post towards the end, would it have made a difference in the outcome for the individuals that were already deceased within the club? I don't believe it would have. And it's unfortunate because that's not what we like to do. We like to get in, get it done, save lives. I mean, that's what we're about. We're really strong type A, success-driven individuals, and we don't like to fail. I don't know a single person that's in emergency management or in fire or EMS or anything as a first responder that likes failure. We don't. It drives us up.
There is only one person in the Pulse nightclub shooting that failed, and it was the shooter.
Absolutely. And I'm not talking about it because you brought that up, so we'll keep that there. But I do that. But man, he's not worth my time or energy at this point.
Yeah, so. Good point. Yeah, like on that same vein of that you're talking about from the responder side, disasters, whether it's natural or man-made, when you're dealing with life-saving operations and really life-impacting operations, and I've had friends who've worked in congregate shelters, and just seeing people lose everything, and that causes them to break down. There's a lot of just, we are success driven. A lot of us are A-type personalities, but that comes at a cost sometimes because we're unwilling to face the reality of that. Despite all the training, despite all the whatever, the stuff that we deal with is not normal.
No,
and
not at all.
There's an impact to you, and I've brought this up on the show before, but there's also an impact to your family. My wife is a graphic designer. She is amazing. She has like so many accolades to her name. She didn't sign up to like walk over to the tornado and punch the tornado in the face and try to pull people out of buildings, right? Like, there was one time where USAR came up to me in Georgia tornadoes, and they asked to figure out the math because I did analytics on the national team. Hey, there was a boy that was sucked out of a home. Could you figure out where all the different possibilities of where he could have gone and how far? Well, unfortunately, I did the math, and it basically because of my degrees, I knew he would have been disintegrated in the tornado. Still gave the trajectories of where it could have gone based off of rotation and speed and all this other stuff, but they never found him. That is an incident that like really frustrates me. But I understand it. My wife didn't sign up for that, and especially when I started doing the man-made stuff, especially in DC, and I don't talk about that too much, but I told her about it one time, and it like really shook her for 3 days, like, oh, like this is what my husband really does, like, and I think we have to talk about that, the Pulse nightclub, you just said that like literally everybody was flying by you or flying into the scene and trying to deal with this. That's a lot of people and their families who for 3 hours were worrying about this, this terrorist. What would you say if you could influence the country somehow, what would you say to that aspect?
Well, and I John, obviously this will, shouldn't come as a surprise, obviously, to first responders. We talked about it. We talked about strong type A personalities. We seem impervious to emotion, and we don't, on the outside, in most cases, we don't even seem like things like that rock us. Like, that's just not in our genes. We just don't do that. But even if you look back as far as 9/11, there's tons of photography out there that show you these members from FDNY and the Port Authority and the police departments and stuff that were already grieving over the enormity of the event. So, we see that a lot in our mainstream media. They a lot of times they'll do a good job of showing all the great things and, all the video and stuff like that. And they also show all the horrific things that have occurred, the loss of life and, doing it with some regard to the sensitivity of the situation. But the first responders, for a long time, we've always just kind of, we did what we did, and I wish we could have done more. And then we move on to the next day. And in this case, John, I can tell you personally, not the case. And my number one goal in the days and weeks following that, I was genuinely concerned about the members that responded to that call. Now, you have some that are calloused and hard, and they may not ever show you that it's bothering them or it bothered them that we couldn't do more. I'm the incident commander. I wore that weight on my shoulders that there wasn't more we could have done for the individuals in the club. But given the information I had at the time, based on the resources I had at the time, and the enormity of the event, I mean, mass casualty is not a nice thing, because in mass casualty, you are actually being asked to triage. That's what we do. And if you have a black, you have a black. You move on. In normal responses to, say, just a shooting with 1 or 2 victims, that may be an individual that we actually initiate life-saving measures in and we try to resuscitate. But in a mass casualty, when you have limited resources and you're really trying to impact those that have an opportunity for survival, that's the mode that you are trained to operate in. And sometimes it just gets nuts. So, I spent a good amount of time. Our department was in its incipient phase of developing a peer support group. A lot of departments across the country rely on workers' comp and things like that. And they have IAP, and then they have EAP, employee assistance programs. The reality of those employee assistance programs is they are contracted by the city. And, I probably will catch flack on this again, but it's a contracted service that's low bid for mental health providers that can come in and help somebody if they're having a difficult time. But I don't know that they really have the ability to relate to what just occurred. So in the days following, we did some debriefings and we got all that organized through the efforts of our local and other members. And we had members that came from Boston and they were part of the Boston Strong effort. We had members that came from FDNY. We had members that came from all over the country who convened in the city of Orlando to be there for the first responders. Now, the city themselves, they did an amazing job in their response for the victims of the event. There was a lot of relief efforts set up and stuff like that. And, I caught some scrutiny over this in the months and years following. But I feel like it's got to be said, the responders, in my opinion, weren't given priority. And I'm not saying that we needed a priority, but we were asked 3 days later to go back to work and be ready to do the same thing all over again. Matter of fact,
I was just wondering how long you guys had off. 3 days.
Actually, the unfortunate thing of it, John, is we demobilized the event just after 5 a.m. And a couple units actually got caught on calls going back to the station. Now, that was not my call. I was still in the demobilization phase of the event, and units were being return back to the station. And, here's a unit that just worked an MCI with 49 victims, 38, 39, critically wounded, a couple deads that were, just all of that. And they're on their way back to the station, and they catch a man down that is a homeless individual sweeping on a bench or something like that. And do you think they have the patience or the willingness to no? So it has to occur immediately. That process has to start the minute you start demobilizing that. And, there's some opportunities we learned. City did an amazing job with the victims and stuff. The city stepped in to a degree, but it was our peer support group that was in a very incipient phase of development. And the relationships we had with UCF, University of Central Florida, and they have a program out there that has grown significantly for them. And then the support of all the other departments across the country that came in to help provide that. And there were individuals that were having some difficulty with that. John, I've seen a lot of things, but some guys, saw things that they would never see in their entire career, and it was all within one night. I mean, multiple victims, and anybody that understands firearms and stuff like that, what these wounds may or may not look like, or what these individuals may look like. And we had victims being brought out and being brought to us that were well past the point of, they were triaged as a black, and these bystanders that were helping, the club goers themselves, they were trying to help. And I applaud those efforts tremendously. They're bringing that out to us. So not only are they seeing it, and it's maybe their best friend or somebody they were clubbing with that night, but we're seeing it as first responders, and we don't get an opportunity to do anything but just pull the sheet. And that impacts people. So, for my level as incident commander, I wore the weight for several years of whether or not the decisions I made that night were in the best interest of the event. And I spent a lot of time, 2 days later, I won't lie. I can't really, I can't lie about this. I was pissed. I was pissed that not one member of my leadership team at the organization that was above me even reached out to me to say, hey man, I know you had a really bad night and I'd love to talk about it. If you need anything, let me know. And it didn't happen. And maybe I was expecting too much. I don't know. But at that point in time, I feel like I was failed as the member that was representing our presence there. Just a phone call, just say, hey, man, I know you had a shitty night and we want to talk about it. And just want to make sure you're okay. A lot of stuff went on. So I took it upon myself in the days following. I actually compiled the list of every OFD member that was on that call. And I tried to personally call them myself, whether I got a voicemail or whatever. I said, hey, this is Bryan Davis. I'm just calling to see how you're doing. Tremendous work the other night. I know it was a lot, and that was a drive for me. And I felt it important. And then our peer support group, along with some of the actions of these other groups from across the country, they finally got guys on track. And I didn't realize the impact it was really having on me. It was driving things at home. Like you said, you take this home to your family. I mean, my wife was up at 5 o'clock that morning and it's on news, and she knew I was there. She's like, I knew you were there. I knew it had to be you. There's no time I've ever turned on the TV where there's something bad in the city of Orlando happening and you're not connected to it in some ways. But it was
a hero, though.
Really hard, John. And about 2 years after the event, one of my lieutenants, who I consider one of my best friends, he came to me. He said, "All right, man." He said, "It's your turn." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He goes, "You got to take care of you. You've been dealing with this for 2 years. It's time." And not a lot of people know this, but I had to seek professional help. I had to go see somebody to deal with the PTSD because it was creating something of me that I wasn't proud of. And a lot of that had to do with just bearing that weight. An event like that, where you want to give it all and do everything within your power, and you feel like you failed. I mean, I was left. I had a tremendous amount of support from the men and women that were there on that call. My immediate supervisor, good support. He was off that night, not on duty. Actually, I should say she, the assistant chief that would normally be my supervisor that night, she was off. I had some other chiefs from other departments that I've remained acquaintance with since they retired and moved on to other departments. They reached out and called, and maybe my expectation was too much, but just a phone call in some cases goes a long way, just to touch somebody and say, "Hey man, how you doing?" We've never dealt with anything like that. And we've seen stuff like this throughout our entire life. You're affiliated with USAR, and that's how we made our acquaintance through those connections. I couldn't imagine. I've had one interaction in USAR, and I was a flight medic on a flight program, and we flew to New Orleans after Katrina. And we were there specifically just to evacuate ICU patients out of hospitals and move them in. But I got to see it. We flew over the dome, flew over everything, and we saw what it looked like. And I'm like, holy cow. And we're here dealing with ICU patients and stuff that just need to be transported to outlying hospitals. But you're still seeing the tragedy and the huge loss of life that occurred from that event. So those things impact you, man. They stick with you forever. You talked about having visual reminders. The Pulse Nightclub is still there in memoriam of the victims that lost their life. But we have individuals who drive by that scene every third day that were part of that scene. And at some point, that's gotta weigh on them. They've got to see that and remember, and they have these flashbacks. Because we do in first responders, and I'm sure it's the same in emergency management. If you've had those experiences, you have this Rolodex of cards, and it's constantly spinning in your memory bank, and a sound will trigger something with you. And I will tell you that for 2 years, a very loud sound that sounded similar to that of a weapon would startle me. A door. You talked about, how your wife, and same with mine, how your wife is kind of living it through you. You call it crazy, but I go into a restaurant, I'm looking at exits. I'm actually sitting with my back to a door because I want to know that I have an exit to get out of something. And I've taught my wife and my kids that, and it's quite scary actually, because you're like, you don't want to do that. You don't want to feel like you're overcautious, but that's what events like this do to you as a human being. I don't care if you're a firefighter. I don't care if you're a nurse, a graphic designer. It doesn't matter if you've been involved with something like that. The individuals that were involved in the Pulse nightclub, all the patrons that were there, this will impact them for the rest of their lives. So it's not just us as first responders, it's everybody is going to be impacted by that. And now what we're seeing is because of all the avenues with social media and stuff like that, you see it immediately. I mean, we just had a firefighter that lost his life in California, after being shot by another firefighter. What a tragedy that is. But you knew within minutes, that's in your neck of the woods, you knew within minutes that was happening. And you're like, we didn't have that 10 years ago or 15 years ago. You didn't know that something this big was going on in California other than the news. You didn't see it in social media or Twitter or, Facebook or whatever it is you're using for those platforms. So, but the recovery piece of it, I was doing some presentations as I shared with you, and I coined it the before, during, and after of an active shooter event. And that was a presentation about an hour long. And I started really diving into that thing. And I'm like, man, really what I want people to get out of this is the aftermath. And I changed it to the before, during, and aftermath of an active shooter event. And keeping in mind our thoughts and prayers and feelings for the victims of an event like that. But this was geared more towards taking care of each other and our first responders that are dealing with that, because we see this day in and day out and day in and day out. It's not to this magnitude, but we're still dealing with it. We're still dealing with individuals who've lost their life over senseless acts, things of that nature, and it'll take you back. I mean, you just see that.
So there's you make two really good points, and I'm going to actually start with the second point, and I'm going to go to the first point after that. The people are in this weird place right now when they hear that this one aspect of this one topic is important to me. You can name any topic. We're Gay Pride Month right now, right? So Gay Pride Month, Black History Month, right? You hear other people of like, why isn't there this month or that month? It's like, okay, you can still talk about this. It doesn't have to diminish this other piece. And so I think it's 100% acceptable to say, as a first responder, as the incident commander, as somebody who would have really appreciated somebody reaching out in a catastrophic event saying, how are you doing? To say, hey, I think we need to be aware that there's this group over here, the first responders and their families, that need mental and emotional care. First aid. I don't even like care. I like saying first aid, mental first aid, right? You've been through a mentally traumatic event that requires medicine. And that medicine might be sitting around the table and talking to people who you don't have to really go through the event with. It might be talking to a professional, which I think, by the way, that is one of the toughest things you can do. It's to own up to that, man up, woman up, whatever, and say like, hey, I'm going to tell my buddy that he needs to take care of this. That's a tough thing to do. And then it's even tougher to say, you're right, I'm going to take care of this. So I applaud you, and I'm a big fan of that. And so I think it's okay to say that. I think it's also okay to note inherently, you should also be taking care of, the victims and their families. And when you have to say duh, I think that's the point of the conversation. You're like, oh, okay, it's not offensive one way or the other. Things are obvious.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So,
and it is tough. You mentioned, it took me a while to really, I don't want to use the word concede, but address that help was needed. And I think you've met enough officers throughout your career in emergency management and disaster preparedness, and what you do with USAR. I mean, those guys are put to task time and time again with similar situations. But it is one of those things. It's tough as a chief officer to be able to say, hey man, I'm really not doing well with this, because you don't want your peers to look at that as a weakness. And I'd like to believe that our industry has evolved to where individuals don't see that as a weakness in their superior officers or their leaders. They see it more that we are vulnerable just like anybody else. And it does impact you. If anything, it's made me more aware about how it impacts our members. And, you know, it's just one of those things. And like I said, I talked about changing that to where it was the before, during, and aftermath. And it was the aftermath in the mental health and mental awareness that first responders across the globe, not just here, but anywhere that deals with this type of event, what they may need, because we're asked to go back and do that.
Hey, you just cut out on me. Can you hear me? I can't hear you. You just cut out. Can you hear me? Uh-oh. Hey,
Sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I gotcha. Sorry about that. I don't know if that was me or you.
I don't know, but it was muted for a second. But let's we'll just edit this part out. Amin's our video guy. Cut this out. Let's start. If you could just review the question of you know, what you were just talking about.
Yeah, you know, we just gotta spend a little more time focusing on our first responders, because we're asked to go back and do that job the very next day, time and time again. And it's tough. I think, you know, whatever part we got cut out there with, thank you, technology and COVID, we mastered it, but we're still trying to figure it out. But you know, it's hard as a chief officer or somebody that is revered or admired or respected throughout the ranks. It's hard to reach out and say, hey, you know, I need a little bit of help with this. And I hope that across the country, I hope that message is resounding to where we as first responders, I mean, number one cause of suicide rates amongst first responders is the highest it's ever been in years. And, you know, I was part of 10 years ago of looking at a line of duty protocol and looking at what was in place by the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation and all that. You know, there was a time where suicide wasn't even considered as part of a line of duty death. PTSD wasn't really talked about, and it was believed that suicide was a choice and that those individuals did that on their own. So why should they get benefits of a line of duty death or something like that? And that's evolved. Right now we're talking about suicide amongst first responders, and we're talking about how important it is that they get the help they need. So, you know, I take the Pulse event. I'm very proud and sad in the same moment. I felt like it was a shining moment for me personally. Yes. Is that what you want to put on a resume when you're applying to do something or go somewhere or do it's not really, shouldn't be the highlight of that, because there was a lot of sadness that came out of that. It wasn't the highlight of the career. And again, the men and the women that partook in that event and our mutual aid responders and everybody else came in, John, at the end of the day, they're the ones that really made it happen. Sure, you put the plan in motion. You're the guy that's coming up with this plan. You're the guy, as you describing water flows and trajectories and all this to hopefully find this young child. But at the end of the day, those people are the ones that are out there actually doing the work and making it happen. So I made it a priority. Couple years really trying to make sure that these guys, we had a lot of people that really did a tremendous job and trying to get involved and make that happen. And then finally, you know, a couple years after, I got the tap on the shoulder and, you know, said, hey, it's your turn. So, you know, I understand this is disaster tough and we're talking about preparedness and stuff like that. And we can be prepared. It's that before, right? The before and the during don't always match. But it's really the after. The after is the piece. Yeah, we talk about cleaning up. We talk about rebuilding our communities. We talk about, you know, getting infrastructure back in place and everything else. but the rebuilding part of that is the aftermath that an event like that may have on the responders that were there.
Yeah.
I'm not a wildland firefighter, but I couldn't imagine losing one of my groups that got overtaken by a wildland fire. I couldn't imagine that. I wouldn't know what to do with that.
Yeah. So, man, so I'm going to go back to that. The second point that I wanted to talk about, you kind of just highlighted it again. So like most of my careers have been focused on the response pieces, operations and planning for specifically response. And so it's kind of funny, like disaster preparedness in my mind, like the best disaster preparedness you can do is like mitigation. And I'm not talking about doomsday prepping. I'm like super against that actually, but I'm talking about like, is actually going way back in the conversation, talking about the physical makeup of the club. There was no egress in the hallway of the bathrooms. There was no way to get out. And so what they ended up, in one of the bathrooms, they ended up punching through the AC unit, right? And that's how they got out of the other bathroom.
Yep. Yeah, and they were pulling victims out of that opening. So yeah.
Yeah. So like there's something like building codes, like that's mitigating a potential loss of life just by changing building codes. Schools in, I believe, Utah, all new schools in Utah are built with 2 exits in every classroom. That's good emergency preparedness, right? But there's also the MOUs and getting the supplies and getting everybody like, integrated. And I think a big part of that is I am lucky enough to have gone to that USAR training with Walt, who connected us, and really grateful for that. His show just aired, and Joe Hernandez and some of these other guys, because I'm looking at it from, I deployed you all the time. I was the guy that nobody saw that was trying to figure out, do you go to A or B? And now that I can see that integration, I'm like, man, we need much more integrated. But that all aside, let me talk about this one point because it's really important, especially for Father's Day weekend. You talk about the before, and you talked about you checking up on everybody, whether it's a phone call or whether it was like a touch point, whatever. You felt there was responsibility. My thesis in my master's program was all about the psychology of a disaster, specifically to survivors and preventing disaster. And the data is very clear. I said this around Mother's Day because we had that got brought up too. Like, good parents prevent disasters like this from happening. I mean, they don't. It's not a given, or it's not a guarantee, rather. But checking up on people, getting in good environments. We have a problem where, despite in our field wanting to help people, sometimes we forget that the best thing you could do is probably help your family. And the best mitigation of a disaster you can do is in the walls of your own home. And so I kind of wanted to call that out. I don't know how you feel about that, but you kind of took on the parental role anyways, of just doing what another human being should do, to check on people who should be checked on. Right.
Yeah. And it was tough, John, because, it was, you're at this, you're dealing with, at that level, you're morally, you're torn because you wanted to do more. You look at the patches or the badges and the things that you're wearing in that time, and that there was, you wish you could have done more, right? We go to a house fire with a victim that we're not able to rescue and they perish in that fire. I've seen crews, beat themselves up. That's a normal reaction. And they go through, what could we have done differently? Could we have gotten in there quicker and stuff? And those are situations that you keep adding that little card to your Rolodex of emotions and your Rolodex of experiences. And at some point, you're going to see something or hear something or do something that is going to remind you of that moment in time. And it's going to trigger an emotional response with you.
Right.
I'm not a doctor. I don't have any background in psychology or psychiatry. But I can tell you, I've done enough with it over the last few years that I know, just from the experience, what that looks like. So that's a big deal.
Yeah. I do have to give this caveat. I am not a doctor or a psychologist, but the psychology of disasters and how people, like the social vulnerability of like going through something traumatic. We don't get political on the show, and so we're not going to get political, but the news that just came out about not continuing the support of the family is pretty mind-boggling to me, or not the family, the victims rather. And so it's just, I think we have a responsibility to provide a long-term awareness of the people who have been through this, because they could end up hurting themselves, and they just survived. You want to keep them surviving. That might be 2 years down the road. That might be 5 years down the road. You know, we had Joe Hernandez, legend in USAR, was telling me about an experience of a firefighter who had pulled the children out of the nursery of the Oklahoma City bombing. And everybody, if you know that story, you know that all those children had deceased.
Yes.
A couple years later, he had a kid, and the kid was sleeping in the same position and looked like one of the children he had pulled out. Game over, and a career.
Yeah.
Right. And who would have ever thought that years later you would have had a kid? The kid was just sleeping in a toddler position, probably the butt up in the air. That's how my son sleeps, anyways. He's 2 years old. He keeps his butt up in the air. It's hilarious.
Yeah.
But like, a normal event triggers something in the background, and without adequate recognition, like the same people who provide first aid on the daily, you guys need to have the reality of like the first aid of your mental and emotional health. I think we've kind of beat that one quite a bit, but I appreciate you.
We do a lot in-house, in the firehouse. We sit around the table and we break bread together. I mean, that is part of the traditions and the culture as a first responder. And that does help a lot, but we are peers, and that's why we call it peer support. And that level of training may or may not be anything more than other just being somebody that's willing to listen. But there is a need across the country. It's not just us. It's across the country, and it's probably across the globe with first responders, that there has to be some type of support mechanism there, because we are the ones, and look at our military, our U.S. military. I mean, look at the horrendous things that they are involved with and what they do to protect our freedoms as an American. What mechanisms do they have in place? Because that's where PTSD originated from, believed, is through the military. And then now it's progressed into being identified in the work of first responders and disaster preparedness and things of that nature. So, it is a crisis, if you will. And again, I'm no expert, but, wrapping it up with I lived it. I mean, the event, a lot of great things to talk about the event. The men and the women that were on that event did a phenomenal job. We could spend a whole nother cast talking about just the structure and the operation and stuff like that. We're on the anniversary of the event, and 5-year anniversary this year. And I make it a point every year, those 52 members of my organization that are still there, whether it's via email, text message, or a phone call, I make it a point every year just to remind them that, people are there if they need them. And sometimes you'd rather do that in person, but I think just the touch, just the, hey, I'm thinking about you type thing goes a long way. And I hope that our commanders that were at some of the other horrific events that have occurred across this country, whether it had 5 victims or 50 victims or in between, that they understand their first responders, police, fire, EMS, hospital workers, all that, they need that mechanism in place to help cope with those situations.
I think we've been highlighting this a lot without actually using the word, and the word is leadership. This is a great discussion, not just for the after actions of what happened and good ideas, but also if you're an emergency manager and you are responding to, your local flood, which is not the Pulse Nightclub Type 1 incident, but if you're responding to this, and your emergency manager, the mitigation officer down the room, is freaking out because it was their job to make sure that levee was fixed and it didn't get fixed, and 500 homes got flooded because of that. That's impactful for that person.
Yeah. And if it's impactful, John, if they care, because I think.
But this is the thing. I actually think most
that don't care.
I think that is a minority, really. I mean, we all got in the field because we like helping people, right?
Yeah. You will come across an individual from time to time who genuinely is disconnected from the event emotionally because they really don't care, or at least that's the way they appear. So,
Yeah,
um,
well, sometimes that's
but very, very small percentage,
yeah.
like you said.
For me, what I found more often with those types of people is that they have, obviously, there's always the jerk, but but I would say most people in that situation, they've been through enough things that they cannot take the emotional toll anymore. So they're I'm here to do the job. But in any case, like going back to that mitigation officer, yeah, absolutely check on that person. Anytime you see a behavior change, anytime you do something that's impacting people's lives, um, that's a good time to say like, hey, how you doing? And I think that's a great leadership skill. I think that's a great note to end on. We typically do like 45-minute episodes, and so obviously I like talking to you because we're about an hour and 20 into this now, and so it's awesome. And I just want to thank you again. You said for the first 2 years that you kind of struggled. I hope that you're beyond that, because people like me who look at the after action reviews, people like Walt, your colleague, who says this guy's the man. The guy who, like we look at a Pulse Nightclub and we do after actions on it because of it's so unique. You did great. And there's a lot of people that you haven't met who have looked at your work and highly respect what you've done. And not just you, but everybody who responded to that. The active shooter is like one of the worst case scenarios because it's murdering innocent life.
Yeah.
And when
absolutely.
you're dealing with that, I think, like I said, one of the toughest things you ever did, you proved that you are disaster tough by saying, hey, I'm going to address this. But I just wanted to let you know that you have our respect. We'd love to have you come back on the show and talk about some of those other
Absolutely.
aspects.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, thanks again, Chief. And, you're always welcome. In fact, to the Chief's point, especially being Father's Day weekend and everything else and long-term care, hey, if anybody needs to reach out, send us an email at info@dobermanemg.com and just say, like, hey, like, we'll hear you out. We'll point you in the right direction, whatever. We'll do what we can. And, we did this with Joe as well. And so happy to get those emails, happy to help out. If you don't want to let anybody know you want to talk to a stranger, like, again, like we'll figure something out, man. So, yeah, thanks again, Chief.
Absolutely. Anytime, John. Appreciate the opportunity. And, hopefully the message, obviously preparedness, because that's what you're talking about. And I coined it the before, during, and after. And we talk about that in emergency management and MCI and USAR. And, we do these drills and we do all this training. It's different. We plan it, we talk about it, and a lot of the components of it do work. But as an incident commander and something that has that, what I call tactical fluidity, you have to be fluid with the moment. So when it changes from an active shooter to an MCI to a hostage situation to an explosive ordnance device, when all those things are happening, there are so many moving pieces in that. You have to have that operational fluidity, and you have to be a proactive commander, meaning you're not reacting to what's occurring. You're actually trying to stay a step ahead of that and anticipate the growth of the event or the projection of the event, if you will. So that's one of the big things. And then, like I said, we changed that last word from after to aftermath. That's the piece that I think is important. We've done tremendous work with UCF Restores, our own peer support group, which is done through our benevolent association, and then other groups that came to our aid during this tragedy. And then we reciprocated that a year later in Las Vegas, and then some of these other events that are occurring. So if the message is there, John, I appreciate the support. I'm humbled by the outpouring of accolade for the event. Again, it wasn't just me. It was the men and the women that came to that event that evening that made it what it is. And appreciate Walt, as always. He's been a good peer of mine for many, many years. And we share a lot of discussions back and forth about stuff. So thank you again for the opportunity. I look forward, if there's another opportunity to divulge into a little bit more, I'd love to be a part of that.
Absolutely. So I'll actually get Ashley on that right now. So, hey, so I got to do the super cheesy part, the part that I kind of hate. But everybody, this is why I hate it, because I'm so cheesy. But it is important because it shows that, like, hey, this matters. So if you liked what Chief Davis was talking about today, if you got something out of it, which you should have, you need to give us, gosh, this sounds so cheesy. You gotta give us that 5-star rating.
Absolutely.
You need to subscribe. You get back on the, help them get back on the show. It's why it's important. Follow us on social media, the Disaster Tough Podcast on Instagram and Facebook, or you can follow us our business, Government Emergency Management, on LinkedIn and on Facebook as well. We're also on Instagram. We're all over the place. So make sure you follow us. We're going to be posting more about Chief Davis and some of the quotes, some of the stuff that he's had on here on the show. So it's going to be really great next week. And we'll see you back every week. Thanks.